Welcome to the final day of class where we talk about Mary Rowlandson and the quiz and present. You have the next, 8 minutes to finish your quiz. And then Victoria will present and then we'll talk about it. Yeah. Couple more minutes. Okay, so sorry, I was not paying attention. Welcome to the final class. It's good to see you all. Um, I'm excited to talk with you guys about Mary Rowlandson, who will be our final kind of piece for the semester. Um, let's see. So the idea is that your final paper is due this coming Tuesday at midnight. We're not having class that day to give you extra time to work on your paper, but I will be in this Zoom class. And so if you want to drop in and bounce ideas off me, or if you get stuck, or if you have a question, you can pop in and ask me questions. Okay. Yeah. Any questions about the final paper so far? Okay. All right. So we are going to have Victoria start by kind of presenting on Mary Rowlandson, and then we'll talk together about it. Okay, Victoria.
So this is my presentation on the captivity narrative of Mary Rowlandson. And this is actually a picture of a plaque that is 50 feet from the spot where she was freed. So just a brief historical background. This occurred during the time of the King Philip's War, and Miss Rowlandson was taken prisoner in the winter around the halfway point of the war. And her account was published in 1682. And throughout her time with the natives, she travels all around New England. And this map actually has each of the numbers of the removes on it, so you can see where she was at each spot. So the King Philip's War, it took place between 1675 and 1672 in the southern parts of New England. It was an attempt to stop English settlement on native lands.
Massasoit.
Massasoit, or King Philip, took power of the Wampanoag tribe after his brother died in British captivity after being accused of plotting a war. And tensions rose between the natives and the colonists after John Sassamon, a native man, was found dead after warning settlers that King Philip was planning on attacking settlements. And 3 Wampanoag men were found guilty and hung for this. So the war officially started on September 9th, 1675. There were many battles with casualties on both sides. The article that I read said that there was a British attack on a native town and that 300 people, including women and children, were killed in the attack. So in spring of 1676, the tide started to turn in the British's favor. And on August 20th, 1676, King Philip died in battle. They ended up mutilating his body by beheading him and then having his body being drawn and quartered. And his head was placed on a stick and displayed for 2 decades. And his death marked the end of the war, though there were still many clashes that happened afterwards. So on February 10th, 1676, was when Miss Rowlandson was taken prisoner in Lancaster. A group of natives attacked the town and they killed people and took some captive. And Miss Rowlandson, along with some of her friends and family, were still inside of her house when the natives shot at them and eventually set the house on fire. The adults were separated from the children, though one of her children was able to stay with her. None of them ever thought that something like this would happen, even though they were in the middle of a war. And her husband was away during these events, so he was spared from having to witness this.
Yeah.
I couldn't figure out how to say it.
Yeah.
So then in the first branch of their journey, they don't travel too far and end up in Wemiset, which would eventually become New Braintree. And on their way there, she acknowledges the fact that her child is going to die. And she also takes one of her child from one of the men holding her, and they don't really fight back with her on this. And when she falls down, they let her ride one of their horses, but they do laugh at her when she falls off the horse. when they get to town, she's sold to Guanamo,
Want them open? I don't know.
Guanamopan. Her child dies the first night that they're there, and while she's away, the natives bury her body on a hill nearby, and they bring her to where she was buried. So then she learns that another one of her children, Mary, is nearby but isn't allowed to see her. But she does get to see her son Joseph, who shows up a couple other times. Not long after, they're on the move again, and it turns out that the British Army is after them. So the natives choose a few men to leave behind so that they can fight and everyone else can escape. And they end up crossing a river, and they make rafts to get across, but only some make it before nightfall. But everyone makes it across eventually. And when the British Army gets there, they don't cross it. And the next day, they're on the move again, and they head deeper into the wilderness, which is kind of scary for Miss Rawlinson because she realizes that she's getting further and further away from British society. They come across an abandoned English town, and they raid the fields. And Miss Rawlinson joins in so that she can have a source of food. But people keep stealing everything that she finds. So then they go and they meet King Philip. Miss Rawlinson thinks that she can go across the river in a canoe like how most of the group is, but they tell her that she has to walk another 4 miles up the river with a different part of their group. And they meet King Philip's people, and they're happy about the victories that they've achieved. And Miss Rawlinson starts freaking out because she thinks that they're going to kill her, but they promise her that they won't. And she actually gets to meet King Philip, and he asks her if she smokes, and she explains that she doesn't, and that God gave her the power over it, and that smoking is the bait of the devil, so that they will lose time. He also asks her to make a shirt for his son, which she does, and several others ask her to also make clothes throughout the narrative, and for the most part, they always pay her. So then they move further upriver, where Miss Rawlinson is close to Joseph again, and she tries to visit him but gets lost, and she talks about the beauty of nature that God has created. This is also where we see a young woman showing her kindness. She feeds her and lets her cook her food in her wigwam, and she gives her a spot to sit by the fire, but she's eventually kicked out by someone else. On their travels, Miss Rawlinson is given things to carry, but because of her tiredness and hunger, she struggles to keep up with everyone else. It's also around this time that she asks her master if she'll be sold back to her husband, and he says yes. Her hope from this is squashed when her mistress says that she wants to go back where they were before, so this group has to split up. And because of this, they end up moving further away from the bay, which is where her husband is. So then it's kind of around this time she's told 2 lies about her family. One is someone tells her that someone cut off a piece of Joseph and ate it, but we see Joseph again within a few paragraphs, and he seems to be fine other than the fact that he's sick. And she's also told several lies about her husband being dead, which he isn't really. He's just very sad about the fact that his whole family's gone. We also find out about an incident where Philip's maid comes and asks for a bit of Miss Rawlinson's apron so that she can make something for his child. She's asked to do this both times, which she refuses. But she eventually gives the maid her whole apron because her mistress threw a large stick at her. This is also the point in their journey where her master and mistress's child dies, and Miss Rawlinson doesn't seem to sympathize with them, even though her own child died earlier on, and they were kind to her after. Instead, she comments about how there's good that came from it for her, and it's the fact that now there's more room for her in the wigwam. So now they're making their way towards the bay, and her spirits are getting better because now she has food and thoughts of being home, of getting home. Some other natives meet up with them and tell them that Miss Rawlinson has to go to Wachusett, which is going to end up becoming Princeton, for talk of redeeming the captives. And this also helps with her spirits. There's a few nights that they stop in towns, and in one of them, she ends up going around to different wigwams asking for food and space to sit at. And when she returns to her own wigwam, she's told that she disgraced them by begging, and that if she does it again, they're gonna punish her. We also learn about two of her master's wives. There's Onyx, which is the older woman who is nice to Miss Rawlinson, and Whittemore, who is the one that she's been traveling with this whole time, who has not been nice to her. She is asked how much money her husband is willing to pay to get her back. And even though she knows that they lost everything, she tells them that he could pay 20 pounds, but she asks if they could have him pay less. And they're like, no, 20 pounds works. So then finally, she gets to go home. And at first she's told that she has to wait for her husband to get her, but eventually the natives agree to bring her to him instead. They pass through Lancaster in their travels, and it's still destroyed and essentially abandoned. When they get to Boston, she gets to see her husband again. And while they are happy, they also think about their children. They find out that Joseph and Mary are free and nearby. Mary is in Providence, and Joseph is somewhere closer to the Boston area. And eventually the family moves to Boston. We're also told throughout the narrative that other members of their family, as well as their friends, are freed. So freedom is one of the big things in this story. It's the one thing that Miss Rawlinson wants other than safety. And she asks about it throughout the course of her account. And while she's told that she will be freed, it seems that it'll be under the natives' conditions. So then, how does Miss Rawlinson see the natives? She doesn't really like them. They destroyed her town. They keep taking her stuff. They make her work on Sundays. And, there's all these lists of reasons why. And she sees them as heathens and infidels and basically anything that isn't human. And it seems that, there are exceptions, and these are the natives that are nice to her. And she also thinks that their food is trash, but it seems to grow on her over time. Religion is another aspect of her narrative that popped up a lot. She prays to God constantly for help, which it seems like he gives it to her sometimes. Like Joseph conveniently shows up after Miss Rawlinson prays to God to give her something nice. And she also thanks God for the well-being of herself and others. And the natives don't respect their religion. Joseph says that he prays on his stomach so that he won't get in trouble. And Miss Rawlinson's mistress throws her Bible outside at one point, and she's forced to work on Sundays. Mm-hmm. And these are my discussion questions. So how do you feel about the way that the Native people were described in this narrative? Do you think that it's because we're seeing them through Miss Rawlinson's point of view? Do you think that her characterization of them is justified?
Personally, I thought it was really interesting, not necessarily how she describes them at first, because it's a very propagandized, if that's the right word, version of how she describes them. It's like exactly how all of the settlers were describing natives around that time. But it kind of evolves as we get deeper into her captivity, where it's like less and less talking about brutality and more like getting into the human side of them, which I thought was really interesting. Like starting to see them less and less as these savages, less than human creatures that she was told about, and more as like, yeah, right now they're not being too nice to me, but they're still human beings.
Yeah, I feel like she never gets to that point. I'm always waiting for that. I kind of feel like
No, I don't think she like solidly gets there, but I think it's a kind of weird evolution towards that point.
yeah. I keep waiting for her to be like, oh, actually, they're not that bad. You know, we're all just caught in a war, but like, you know, like one page before she's released, she's like, oh, I was just like Daniel in the lion's den. So there's one kind of example of dehumanizing, right? Yeah. Like they're beasts, they're predators. Mm. So I think propagandist is a good word. I also racist. Right? Yeah. What do you think, Victoria?
I'm not too sure because I feel like she definitely describes them in a way that makes them seem not human. Like when she constantly calls them like infidels and
Savage.
hair,
Heathen.
yeah, heathens. That was the word I was trying to think
Yeah,
of.
yeah.
Yeah, and I definitely think that we are seeing them this way because we're seeing them the way that she saw them.
Mhm.
So my next question is, do you think that the war going on has an impact on the natives' treatment of Miss Rawlinson?
I mean, the entire reason that she's basically a prisoner with them is because of the war. I think that's like a big part of it. The entire war you mentioned earlier was because settlers wanted more land and they kept expanding their territory, which obviously the natives had very little opinions of that for obvious reasons. So they kind of, just like we generalized, like as settlers, just like the settlers generalized the entire native populations as brutal and savage, it was the other way around. I absolutely think that the war impacted their treatment of her.
I agree. And so like the places where they are cruel to her, she kind of sees it as like a personal attack, whereas like I'm more inclined to see it as like you're a prisoner of war. Yeah.
And then why do you think she decided to publish her account, especially since it was nearly a decade later?
That's a good question. I gotta be propaganda, right? Again, like another more conflicts, and probably also people were curious, right? Like I can imagine she being like tired of having to tell every single person she met, like, I don't want to talk about it, and like, or like telling them the whole thing. So, you know, I think people were probably pretty curious about the Native Americans and the Native American lives, and they kept asking her about it. Did you find anything out about that, Victoria?
I didn't.
Okay, just curious. I feel like I read at some point like that she was like, you know, she was like, you know, I'm tired of telling people about this, so I'll just write one and everyone can read it, and then you know, we can all move past it.
I think that's the end of it.
Good. Excellent job. Yay. All right, so let's see. I gotta exit full screen and okay. Okay. So Victoria covered a ton. So did an awesome job kind of covering a lot of this stuff. So here's kind of, you know, the first, you know, printing of it. All right, Rawlinson's background, you know, she was a Puritan, kind of like Bradstreet, living in Massachusetts, originally born in England, and they came to America for religious freedom. What do you think? Do you see a lot of religious freedom here? Or, you know, what do you like thinking about all of the times, like when you were in grade school and thinking back to like the first Thanksgiving and, you know, the Pilgrims and the Native Americans, like we're definitely given one particular kind of narrative about the Puritans and that they came to America for religious freedom. But what do you think?
So, and I'm not gonna comment on history because we all know that obviously that history is not true. They didn't come and take it away for religious freedom. But there's definitely a lot of religious undertones in this. She quotes the Bible. Like half of the book is it's just passages from the Bible.
Mhm.
It's like, okay, you can chill.
She's married to a minister. She got to represent. Yeah.
Yeah, but you know, the main reason we're taught that they came for religious freedom, it was really just like they really hated how religion was presented in England. So they're like, we're gonna go start our own super religious country
And you know,
across the sea in the new lands. And
even
it
their
was like,
name, where they call themselves Puritans, like we want the purest form of religion, right?
yeah, it was also like people say freedom of religion, and once you got here there was literally no freedom of religion. You were Puritan.
Yeah, and if not, you were executed, burned at the stake, or annihilated with genocide, right? So this whole idea of religious freedom is very euphemistic, I would say, if not outright fake news, right? It's this very specific kind of Puritan religious freedom. So Rowlandson was captured and held for 11 weeks or close to 3 months or an entire semester of college, which I think is kind of funny, right? The text was originally published as The Sovereignty and Goodness of God. So it kind of has you know, a really big kind of title page. You can see like, you know, Sovereignty and Goodness of God, and then like another title and then another title. They just did this. Generally nowadays people just call it the captivity narrative. But I think the fact that she initially kind of titled it The Sovereignty and Goodness of God, or an account of my captivity, is telling, right? It was also considered the first kind of American bestseller. It was like widely published, lots of people read it, super influential. And it speaks to the kind of friction caused by intercultural encounters between settlers or colonialists and indigenous people of the New World. All right, so in the introduction, we learn that, you know, as Victoria said, Lancaster. The introduction kind of puts it up there already that, you know, when she was kept by the Native Americans, she was treated with gross cruelty. And this was by her editor at the time who wrote this. So what genre of literature is this?
Not biography. Would it be biography? Autobiography? Would it be considered? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Because it feels like it's towing the line between autobiography and memoir.
Oh, I wasn't really drawing much of a distinction between, but I was thinking, you know, it's nonfiction, or at least it presents itself as nonfiction, right? And so does that mean that it's truthful? Crystal is shaking her head emphatically no.
Yeah. The one thing that kind of pissed me off about this was that she wrote it after she was freed. So like it's so easy for her to just like embellish things or like make them go in her favor, make her look better, make one certain group look worse than another. So I don't know. Like if it wasn't written in real time, it's hard to really, like, I hate to say it, but take it seriously.
Even if it
Because
was written in real time, like
yeah,
she's
that too.
so
But
deeply biased,
yeah,
right?
I was gonna say that she's extremely biased towards the Native Americans, and it's like it's a war. Like clearly there's shit going on both sides, and like it's funny how, like, I forget who mentioned this, like she speaks highly of the native, well, more highly of the Native Americans when it's convenient for her, when she got something out of it, you know what I mean? Like just say you're a like
Right.
a prisoner and go. Like you don't need to like make it worse by like injecting racism into it.
And every time they like do something nice for her, she's like, you can see God was taking care of me. And it's
Yeah,
like,
like okay, they don't even credit for like feeding you.
they,
Yeah, like the
they
old
can't
man with
just be like human. No, it has to be God taking care of.
yeah, that yeah. Yep.
And it's so like, even though this is technically nonfiction and autobiography, historians historically have like hated captivity narratives. So we need to, we need to, as we read, pay careful attention to biases, judgments, interpretations, and lenses. And just because it's nonfiction does not make it truthful or historically accurate, right? Like yeah, we can kind of agree that like she traveled 150 miles, all over by walking. We can agree that she was, but like a lot, so much of it is embedded with like her biases and her lenses and her religious kind of identity that, like I said, I keep waiting in the thing for her to be like, we're all humans suffering. I keep expecting her to recognize common humanity, and it never happens. Or at least I feel like it never happens. Okay, so the opening is super graphic, super violent. Especially if you get past the like how she talks about people knocking other people on the head, like, which kind of like is a funny, like, I don't know if it made you kind of laugh, but like anyone else like that, like she talks about people getting knocked on the head, and I just feel like I'm bopping people with, but like she actually means like crushing their skulls with clubs and stuff. So there's a lot of killing of babies and families, disembowelment. One guy is like ripped open. They burn her house down while she and her family are trapped inside, and they shoot, guns at them when they try to escape. Even the dogs are not going outside, and they're trapped in this burning building for like 2 hours. The Lord hereby would make us the more to acknowledge his hand and to see that our help is always in him. So she's like basically like, so they're burning down the house that she's in, and she's kind of like, the Lord is testing me. And it's kind of like, okay. And she is shot, and her 6-year-old daughter is shot. And her nephew is killed in front of her, and she is taken captive, even though before she said many times that she would rather die than be taken captive. She says like, look, I just couldn't do it. I just couldn't like make them kill me. I went with them, I submitted. So I was going to have you do some quick internet research about Sir Philip's War, or Victoria like gave you a lot of information about Sir Philip's War. Really, I kind of want you to think about that last question. So you could do some internet research, or you can kind of just go with that last question. How do you see the war characterized in Rawlinson's narrative? What do you see of the war? What's missing from her account? What's included in her account? Okay. I'm going to give you like maybe like 5 minutes to do that. I'm going to go get a drink of water while you guys kind of write about that, about like, yeah. Mhm. Yeah, I'll be right back. take another minute or two. Okay. So Crystal and Maddie posted, can tell you a little bit about King Philip's War and kind of tell you what I think. So here's so like, you know, 2 or 3 years, between 2 and 3 years, before the war, the Wampanoag had a peace treaty with the settlers, but they violated it numerous times. They didn't want the Native Americans to have access to guns. They wanted only the colonists to have guns. And then, as Victoria talked about, like the colonists took it upon themselves to hang 3, Native Americans. And that led the Native Americans to start raiding settlements and villages. So the settlers formed a militia. It's one of the deadliest, if not the deadliest, war in colonial history, especially given the number of women and children and civilians kind of killed in the war. It basically wiped out the Wampanoags. And half of New England towns were burned, so the white people's towns. Many believe that this war initiated the kind of that this war kind of seeded in the settlers and the colonists kind of a distinct American identity. So it kind of led them to start kind of thinking about themselves as separate from the British Empire, because they couldn't really rely on the British to kind of send soldiers to protect them. And so they had to kind of form their own militia. They had to form their own, military, and take care of themselves, which kind of led to them starting to develop this idea of independence and American identity. So I really see it's really interesting to know this backstory behind King Philip's War, because Rowlandson doesn't have any of that in her narrative. Her narrative starts that, the Native Americans attacked us out of the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night. And so it has none of this background. And so it really, that for me, it also kind of goes toward the more dehumanizing kind of elements, the kind of us versus them, because it makes them seem totally unprovoked, illogical, unpredictable. And those are kinds of elements of Native Americans that kind of persist throughout the narrative. So here's one of the first descriptions she has of the Native Americans. So, the first night where she's captured, she's somewhere between slave and prisoner of war. The Native Americans celebrate a victory, by doing a kind of victory dance around a fire. And she says, "Oh, the roaring and singing and dancing and yelling of those black creatures in the night, which made the place a lively resemblance of hell." She literally sees them the first night as devils, as black, as creatures. I think the language here is really telling. Meanwhile, her kid is legit dying in her arms. And so I don't want to, even though like I am, I'm trying not to judge Rowlandson that harshly because she did just lose everything. And like the sentence right after this, she says like all gone, my husband's gone, I've lost access to him, all my children are gone except for this one babe who's dying in my arms. So she really is completely devastated. And so in some ways, like you can understand why she feels so alienated and so, aggrieved, but at the same time, like by stripping her story of all of its historical context, it definitely also like leads to, propaganda-y kind of interpretations. In the next few nights, the child is suffering and feverish, and they say they're going to kill them if she won't keep quiet. So again, like she really kind of can't stand these people. The daughter dies after about 9 days. And like they showed her, as Victoria said, they showed her the gravesite, but she doesn't know where they were at that point. Like she knows they were in the woods, so she doesn't know where her daughter is buried. She can't really visit her youngest daughter's body. She missed out on the funeral and stuff, and so like all of this is pretty traumatic for Rowlandson. I get it. I don't want to minimize it, but like it's still kind of, so I wish that she, especially as Victoria said, like after, her master and mistress's child died, like, and she was just kind of like, well, that was good because, there's more room in the tent for me. Like there's, no kind of any, like, even after 3 months, there's like no kind of any recognition of like reciprocalness or like common humanity. Throughout, she kind of talks about buying and selling her services, and also how her children are bought and sold, and how she is bought and sold, and how she's eventually ransomed, so bought to be released. A lot of people kind of talk about how in this narrative, Rowlandson kind of characterizes this buying and selling of people as, horrifying, really only because it's white people or white Christians, right? This is King Philip. Yeah. So I know Victoria talked about this already. How does Rowlandson characterize Native Americans? And I really kind of want you to kind of think about how this is similar to or different from how Afro-Ben characterized them. You know what? Let me kind of walk you through a couple things, and then we'll come back to this. So like I showed you from that one bit, like how she characterizes them like as like devils jumping around, around a fire in the middle of the night. Cruel. They're also like always stealing food from her, and so she characterizes them as really thieving. She's always having to hide her food from them, and she sees this as like evidence of their like, or at least when I read it, I kind of feel like she sees it as evidence of their like disgusting, debased human nature, rather than the fact that they're all starving. Does that make sense? So this is on page 68, for instance, and like 64, 65, 66, 67, 68. So like here she's like, they gleaned what they could find. Some picked up ears of wheat that were crickled down. Some found ears of Indian corn. Some found ground nuts, which, I don't know what they are, but she eats a lot of them. Others, sheaves of wheat. Myself got 2 ears of Indian corn, and whilst I did but turn my back, one of them was stolen from me, which much troubled me. They gave her some horse liver, and she talks about how, here it like there came an Indian, blah, blah. I laid it on the coals to roast, but before it was half ready, they got half of it away from me, so that I was forced to take the rest and eat it as it was, with the blood about my mouth, and yet a savory bit it was to me. For to the hungry soul, every bitter thing was sweet. A solemn sight, methought it was, to see whole fields of wheat and Indian corn forsaken and spoiled, and the remainder of them to be food for our merciless enemies. that night we had a mess of wheat for our supper. So tell me what you kind of see here. So we have like two instances where they take her food, and like she says, like she kind of indicates that she's forced to like be savage and scrabble for food because they don't understand common decency, or at least that's the vibe I get. And then like she still sees them as enemies, and like instead of like being thankful for this field of corn so that like they all can eat for once, she's like still like upset that like the field of English food is going to the enemies. Um, on 69, she weeps before them and they comfort her. King Philip is relatively kind to her, and her mistress lets her keep the money she gets from King Philip, even though she offers it to her. But, you know, there's at no point does she say like she was thankful for, you know, their kindness. At no point does she say like, you know, anything about that. Instead, she's really still pretty judgmental. So this is kind of what I was talking to Crystal about. So on 70, I can't remember what I wanted on 70. What did I, 69? She's still pretty judgmental. I don't remember what I wanted. Sorry, guys.
It's
I
the
don't
one
remember.
about the sorry Indian.
Is it that one, you think? Here lived a sorry Indian who spake to me to make him a shirt. When I had done it, he would pay me nothing for it, but he living by the riverside where I went often, I would often be putting him in mind and calling for my pay. At last he told me, you know, and then he gave her a knife. Yeah. And also like,
Then the squaw that gave her food is
yeah,
also on 70.
yeah. I pray God, blah, 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 blah. Indians. I was utterly helpless of getting home. I could barely see. Oh. Yeah. Let's see, what else do I have? Something on 70. She's still pretty judgmental. And then on 71, she talks there, like there's all these examples of like Native Americans treating her well, as Crystal was just saying. And yet, you know, she feels so isolated. I cannot but admire all the wonderful power and goodness of God to me, in that though I was gone from home, I met with all sorts of Indians, and those I had no knowledge of, and there being no Christian soul near me, yet not one of them offered the least imaginable miscarriage to me. So she basically is like, oh, you know, I got lost and I was among all these kind of foreign people, but it's really God who protected me. And so I really feel like here her religion actually prevents her from recognizing common humanity, or, you know, kindness, or, you know, stuff like that. Okay, let's see. On 72, she says like it's kind of impossible for her to predict their behavior. She talks about how they're lying to her, how they tell her at one point that her husband is dead, and then they tell her at another point that he's gotten married to someone else. And so like, you know, when they came near, there was a vast difference. So at one point, a bunch of people dressed in English clothes kind of ride up, and she thinks it's Englishmen, but when they came near, there was a vast difference between the lovely faces of Christians and the foul looks of those heathen. So she sees them as unstable and like madmen. On 82, they are hungry lions, and she is Daniel in the lion's den. And then on 84, once she gets released, 72, 80, 84. And now God had granted me my desire. Oh, the wonderful power of God that I have seen in the experiences that I've had. I have been in the midst of those roaring lions and savage bears that feared neither God nor man nor the devil. By night and day, alone and in company, sleeping all sorts together, and yet not one of them ever offered the least abuse of unchastity to me in word or action. Though some are ready to say I speak it for my credit, but I speak in the presence of God and to his glory. God's power is as great now as it was to save Daniel in the lion's den or the 3 children in the fiery furnace. So I took my leave of them. Yeah. Savage bears, roaring lions, devil. Yeah. So that's kind of what I see really happening in this. There are a couple other common themes. She did travel 150 miles by like more or less on foot over the course of 3 months. And so that's kind of a lot. And it's in February in New England. And so she was like running through the snow and stuff. She talks often about how enormously hungry she is, partly because, you know, you burn a lot of calories in the winter, in the cold, and partly because she's just like traveling a lot. Uh, you know, she gets horse liver at one point. I read you that scene. She also eats a raw fawn slash deer embryo at one point, and she says it was delicious. And so like this is definitely like a theme. And even though this is nonfiction, you could definitely kind of look at and do a bit of analysis on this whole theme of like starvation and eating things that you never thought you would. How tastes change. People, I think, have read this as a kind of metaphor for how her attitude toward the Native Americans is changing, but I'm not sure I would go that far. But it is interesting. She is also like throughout in a lot of instances, she you would think she would question her faith. So at one point she says, like, here I cannot but take notice of the strange providence of God in preserving the heathen. So she can't understand every time the Native Americans win a victory, what God is doing or why it's part of his plan. She keeps trying to kind of explain it, but like it seems pretty disruptive to her whole faith and system of belief. All right. So thinking about some of these ideas now, you know, kind of think about and characterize Rowlandson. What is Rowlandson's view or understanding of difference as evidenced by this captivity narrative? How is it similar to or different from how Aphra-Behn characterized Native Americans at the beginning of Orinoco? I'm going to give you 5 minutes to work on that. Okay. So, oops, hold on one sec. Hopefully you were able to post some stuff. Oops, I'm on the wrong day. Let's see, home. So Afra Ben kind of looked at the Native Americans as like completely innocent, without civilization, Edenic, um, you know, um, noble savage type things. Uh, yeah. And whereas like it's almost like both of these are kind of, it's the two ways that Native Americans have traditionally been seen either as completely innocent and harmless and good, or completely evil and devilish. So like kind of like the idea is that like Native Americans by any colonist are not allowed a full range of humanity or human emotion or human expression or complexity, but instead are either, when if they're either all good, or when they start fighting back against colonists, they kind of flip into being all bad, right? They're either, noble savages or heartless heathens. And so this kind of binary or dualism shows how impossible it is to kind of survive, in a world kind of being taken over by colonists. So the last thing I have for you today is discussion 25.3, which asks, what are you thinking of doing for your final project? What are you going to write about? How can I help you? What do you think? What are the texts? What do you think you might like to do as like a kind of theme or idea? Any ideas you're thinking about? Maybe a potential thesis even. So, yeah. Good, Maddie. I feel like I might have like, I don't feel like I've given enough like attention to your kind of seeing an evolution in Rowlands, and so I have a hard time seeing it. So the
Obviously,
paper.
you'll read it differently. Plus, you've probably read it a couple more times than I have. Because I've only read it once. So
Yeah, but still, that doesn't mean anything. If you see like evidence of her transformation, it might be there. Maybe a paper would help illustrate it. I don't know. Mhm. So Crystal, that's cool. Like I was thinking like you could look at like also like if you wanted to, you could look at Utopia and like how like the idea of like how each is trying to create their perfect world, and how much like a perfect world kind of is subject to one person's complete control. Right.
That'll probably be a little easier because they are like so different. But like I knew I really wanted to do it on Blazing World, but it's again so different from literally everything else we read. So it's kind of like I
Well, I
don't
think the Tempest was probably an influence because considering it starts with a Tempest and she's like blown into a new world, kind of like a Miranda figure, but like maybe without a Prospero kind of there, right? And it's interesting too because like Prospero is so manipulative and so controlling, and the Empress is also kind of not manipulative, but she wants kind of. It's really interesting how she kind of characterizes power differently.
and she's kind of like a wolf in sheep's clothing in a way.
Yeah. And so like maybe your thesis could be like both texts, while they seem really different, like show like kind of give insight into the controlling mind of colonists or something. of imperialists. And then you could look at how like women as evidenced by, Cavendish, kind of try to get control in one way and men do it in the other way, but both of them really need ultimate power.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. All right, Charles. Charles also thinking about Blazing World and Tempest. Othello and Miranda and Ferdinand. Rosalind, you could also, if you wanted to, you could look at Othello and Desdemona and Orinoco and Imoinda, because there's so many similarities there. Both are Black men, both kill their wives, She's not around. She's around, maybe. Okay. Othello and Tamburlaine, huh? Yeah. Trying to think how to help you, Jack. Tamburlaine, so far away. It'd be cool to kind of look at Tamburlaine and maybe compare and contrast to, I don't know, Mary Rowlandson or something. But kind of how religion plays a role or doesn't play a role, or kind of serves kind of how religions, serves the.
Yeah, I was thinking something along those lines, or maybe like how the women played a role in those books.
Yeah. Othello and Tamburlaine. Gosh, you don't want to do Tamburlaine and Rowlandson, do you? The first and the last one we've looked at this semester, and religion and stuff. Religion and gender. But yeah. Okay. Others, let's see. Anyone else kind of posted? Andrew. Orinoco. Yeah, it's an interesting one. Yeah, you could definitely compare and contrast Rowlandson and Orinoco, and kind of even their different views of America, as a kind of paradise, but one full of danger. And who gets the opportunity for like a new life in America. So Charles was thinking Blazing World and Tempest. Power and influence over people and elements respectively. So maybe kind of similar to what I was talking about with Crystal, like maybe you could compare and contrast in Tempest magic and in Blazing World science, and how both of them are kind of like, both of them are used by, the one who really wants the power.
Yeah, like the wielders of power can use
Yeah.
different methods of influence and how they compare and contrast to the influence over others.
So in Tempest it's magic, and in Blazing World it's science, but maybe they're actually not that different.
Yeah.
For the authors, like, because it's the avenue through which both of them gain power.
Yeah.
And control others. So like Prospero kind of makes Ariel do a lot of the magic. The Empress makes the, Beast Men do a lot of the science. And then they kind of sit back and evaluate.
Yeah. So along those lines.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I will, as I said earlier, I'll be here in class in the Zoom link on Tuesday. Drop in if you want to bounce your ideas off me. Otherwise, use that time to work on your stuff. Soft deadline of midnight. And I had a really good semester with you guys. Thank you for reading Shakespeare and his contemporaries, who I know are not always super friendly. But I thank you for reading them with me. All right. Have a good weekend and a good finals period. Let me know if you need any help. And otherwise, hopefully I will see you in person in the future after COVID is over. Okay.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend, Professor.
Me too.